Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, San Francisco's premier author interview program. And today we welcome back an old friend, James Carroll, prize-winning author, and his new book that we want to talk about today is simply called Crusade, but listen to the subtitle, Chronicles of an Unjust War, published by Henry Holt & Company under the imprint Metropolitan Books. Now, did I do well by Holt there with that Metropolitan stuff?
Yes, you did, Judge.
There you
Thank
go.
You very much.
I feel that this is a remarkable book in a number of ways. For example, Jonathan Schell, author of The Unconquerable World, who spent a good deal of time out here on the West Coast at the journalism school in Berkeley, no?
Yes.
A journalistic page of glory, he writes, with unerring political as well as moral instinct, Carroll has shown that it is possible to see and understand the true nature of awful events, not only afterward with hindsight, but even as they unfold when it counts most. And that's what I find so remarkable about this collection of essays or articles, if you will, is that they were written like columns are, somewhat on the fly, at least as compared with a book.
Well, a columnist is observing the passing scene, so you're right. But it's one of the things that's striking about this long collection covering week by week by week over about 3 years is how the passing scene actually turned into a kind of slow motion collapse of a venerable old structure. We watched it come down right before our eyes, and in my columns I just described that collapse. And of course the structure I'm talking about is the post-World War II structure of international order, alliance, and law that President Bush has dismantled for the sake of this terrible war.
And what got you started in a way was Bush's unscripted post-9/11 remark, this crusade. This war on terrorism. Yes. And as you pointed out, that was unscripted. This came, from his frontal lobe, and he meant it.
Yes, it turned out, at the beginning, his advisors told us, and some of us even believed that it was just a slip of the tongue. It didn't mean too much.
Uh-huh.
In the Arab world, of course, it meant an enormous amount because the Crusades are yesterday in the Middle East.
Yeah.
But as events have unfolded, Jim, it's quite clear that what we have launched, tragically, is a crusade. America has stumbled, without really meaning to, into a religious war. And the crusade from this side is being matched by a jihad from the other side. And it's a deep tragedy, and that pretty much defines the terrible mistake that President Bush has made.
Oh, gosh. I want to go back just for a second to read kind of a self-description of the book that you have. It says, this collection of writings against Bush's war, a detailed and contemporaneous chronicle of that war, intends to be a book of memory. No one wants the terrible events that came after the rising of the sun on September 11, 2001 to happen for a second time, except in the realm of remembrance, leading to understanding and commitment. That's really a tough thing to say, but it is the truth. We do need to know things again in memory. It's
true, and obviously the 9/11 trauma lives on in the memory of the American people, but as what? That's the question. Does 9/11 mark us as victims who have a right to strike out in revenge? Or could 9/11 be something else, perhaps an epiphany of our relationship to the people of the world when we suffer from violent assault, which should make us more reluctant than ever to launch violent assaults of our own. We've killed more people in Iraq, alas, including civilians, I'm afraid, than Al-Qaeda killed in New York and Washington and Pennsylvania on 9/11.
Well, and
that should give us pause.
Yeah, and you go into other things that happened because of this declaration of a crusade. You talk about an attempt to transform politics and cultures, can make plain why that transformation must not be brought to completion. And there's just so many things that have gone on. He's betrayed as you say, above all the young men and women whom he so carelessly sent into harm's way. Other nations, including once firm allies, have no choice but to obey an imperial Washington. This proved to be an illusion.
Yes,
it's craziness.
And you're right to remind us that the people paying the terrible burden, carrying the terrible burden of this, are young American soldiers who are in an impossible situation now in Iraq. They're faced now with the uprising of an increasingly large population who increasingly experience this as a war against Islam. And the more that's the case, the more impossible the American soldiers' position will be.
Your book gets several things done, and one of them is it provides perspective on the Afghanistan war, the somewhat forgotten war. We'll talk about that one when we come back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
This is James Carroll Day on Conversations on the Coast. He's here to talk about his latest book, Crusade, Chronicles of an Unjust War, about which John Dower, a winner of the Pulitzer Prize, a book called Embracing Defeat, and John Dower says in part in his remarkable memoir, An American Requiem, that was your big prize winner, James Carroll established himself as an eloquent critic of the immorality and madness of the Vietnam War. In Crusade, he has wedded this moral clarity to both a keen sense of history and an awareness of the enormous complexity of peacemaking. Here is a passionate and devastating critique of the folly fobbed off as realism by the Bush administration in its ill-conceived war on terror. And I think a good example of this keen sense of history wedded to moral clarity is your discussion of what the real threat to this country is right now. This is a tremendously real threat, yes, and an authentic global crisis that requires an urgent response. New technologies and technologies just now being developed threaten, you say, to put in a few hands the destructive power that in former times could be exercised only by sizable armies, and today's Hitler needs no nation, no party, no army. A pound of anthrax will do. Yes. That's scary as in hell.
Yes, it's true. It's a real crisis, and it's only going to get worse in that sense that nihilist individuals will have tremendous power to wreak destruction. And that's why it's urgent that the American government take steps to establish the kind of international order of law and alliance and cooperation that alone will protect the world from proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. For us to effectively give other nations, like first Iraq, now Iran, North Korea, every motive for getting weapons of mass destruction is the highest folly. And of course it also motivates insane individuals to get a hold of some kind or other of such weapons too. So proliferation of these deadly weapons is a huge problem. The United States government has to organize itself to head that problem off, but the Bush administration is going about it in exactly the wrong way.
It's I don't know. As I said, it is scary. The other thing that I wanted to chat with you about just briefly is what I kind of think of as the forgotten war, the war in Afghanistan, which started, as we know, before the activities over in Iraq. And it really was Bush's first big response, if you will, to the 9/11 tragedy, wasn't it?
Yes, which was widely supported. Many editorial boards of newspapers, liberal pundits, liberal politicians supported the war in Afghanistan. It was a mistake. It was the beginning of this disastrous course we're on now. And it was false. It was not a war against al-Qaeda, and it was not a war against Osama bin Laden. It was a war against the fascist Taliban regime. They were a wicked and despotic group, but they were no threat to us.
And they were our former allies,
and we went
too.
after them. Yes, they were our former allies. We went after them because we could defeat them. And we left Afghanistan in a shambles. We've empowered the warlords once again, except for a small zone around Kabul. There is no order in Afghanistan, and American soldiers are once again at risk there. And it was also clear that the Bush administration was going to go on a straight line from Afghanistan to Iraq. And if things had gone well in Iraq, of course, the Bush administration would probably now be in Syria or Iran. So from the very beginning of 9/11, we should have responded to this crisis through the culture of law instead of war. What was needed, the very thing that President Bush and Vice President Cheney now deride, what was needed was an active, massive form of international law enforcement in cooperation with our allies. That's what we should have done to take al-Qaeda out of a place where they can do us damage, and instead we've empowered al-Qaeda.
But incredibly, what the Bush administration has done is denounce or renounce treaties, which would lead to an international law enforcement
effort. They've taken the opposite course. We need more treaties, not fewer. And this government of ours breaks treaties. We abrogated the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty.
Mm-hmm.
Bush applauded the United States Senate for refusing to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Almost the first thing Bush did as president was unsign the treaty establishing the International Criminal Court. That's, of course, where Saddam Hussein should have been brought to justice.
Right.
So what we see the Bush administration doing is dismantling this structure of international order that was so crucial after World War II. And, of course, in the middle of all this, he has effectively ended the process of arms reduction, of nuclear arms reduction.
We got to hold there for a minute. The author of Crusade is James Carroll, so you know darn good and well the book is beautifully written. When we come back, Mr. Carroll, I will read one paragraph that I think is worth the $25 that the book costs. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
This is Jim Foster. It is Conversations on the Coast. James Carroll is our guest. The book, Crusade, Chronicles of an Unjust War. You know, one of the things that you get into in this book is that all the announced reasons for going to war in Iraq, fell apart. There were no weapons of mass destruction. There really was no connection between Iraq and what happened at 9/11. And so that the real reason becomes something like an unconscious wish to be at war, any war, that's been driving George W. and his circle all along. And then you ask us to remember that leaders and whole nations have gone to war exactly as a way out of the ambiguities and alienations of ordinary life. They have defined their purposes in the high rhetoric of honor and glory. And if that doesn't sound like the campaign that's going on now from the Bush people, I don't know what does.
Yes, it's true. It's a tragedy, actually, and this war needs to be much more central to the presidential campaign, and the American people really need to take it on much more directly than we're doing.
Well, one would think that would happen now that we are, over 1,000 killed.
Yes, it's true.
But it hasn't happened.
Not yet.
It hasn't happened. You begin one of the columns dated March 25th, 2003, with some words that I want you to share with the listeners, because it's you writing wonderfully well, and it's powerful, and it's got a bite to it. Could you read just that first paragraph at War in Iraq?
Certainly. Look at what America has become. We are moving on steel treads across the harsh landscape as a creature of destruction, kicking up clouds of unreality through which we see illusions of our efficiency and virtue. The extravagance of our nation's claims for itself is staggering. We can decide alone when the use of overwhelming violence is justified. Before the onslaught of our weapons, enemy resistance will be nil. The display of shock and awe, an unprecedented bombardment aimed less at human beings and buildings than at the human imagination, will bend the world to our will. Unlike all previous powers in history, we can wage war humanely. Our success will be so complete that no other nation will challenge us or imitate us. The time for complexity is past. You are for us or against us. Either way, your world will be a far safer place when we are finished. Those who oppose this war will sheepishly return to the fold, the flock of our dominance. We are so good.
It gives a new name to the word hubris, I think.
Yes, indeed.
But it's true. I mean, I'm sorry to say, it's true. And a few pages after, I don't know whether it's in the same piece or some other one, you have to write, when all is said and done, the preventive war prevented nothing.
Right.
Can you explain to me how the notion of preventive war fits into the Constitution of the United States and the supposed power of the Congress to declare war?
Well, there's that problem, of course, but even more troubling is that the idea of preventive war effectively makes the United States an aggressor nation. An aggressor nation is a nation that crosses borders into another country's territory without direct and immediate provocation, without, that is, a threat, a clear and present danger. And when the United States begins to behave that way, it sets a pattern that other nations will surely imitate. A world full of nations that behaves the way the United States behaves today is a world on the road to ruin, and it will have begun with us. And the real tragedy, of course, is that this is taking place in the post-Cold War period when the world had a rare chance to establish a new structure of peace, and that has been squandered by the United States.
And the great exemplar of justice has become the exemplar of violence and evil.
Yes.
It's been totally turned around.
Yes.
We're not going to end this interview without my reading another paragraph from your book. The obvious difference between Iraq and America is that this nation is a democracy. And that means we U.S. citizens are responsible for the behavior of George W. Bush in ways that the people of Iraq are not responsible for Saddam Hussein. There is good reason to believe that Bush, in his highly personal, irrational, and thoroughly Manichaean campaign against Hussein, has set the very world on a course toward disaster. No one can change that course but us. Those words, James Carroll's, in a book, Crusade, Chronicles of an Unjust War. Remember them. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at Jim Foster COC and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.